The 90s were a melting pot of sounds and styles where rock music wasn't just evolving, it was exploding. Genres like grunge, alternative rock, punk, pop punk, ska, nu metal, and rap rock didn't just coexist, they collided, merged, and redefined what rock music could be. These were also my personal formative years, and from what I remember at the time, all this shape-shifting was perfectly normal. Bands seemed to have a lot more creative license or just creativity to experiment and see what worked, all while one-hit wonders were still a normal occurrence. It was a crazy paradox that record labels were still investing in the development of bands, but due to the fact that the new cool thing kept changing every few years, I think that labels started to get burnt out on trying to keep up with the rising trends. No matter how hard every label tried to predict the next new band, in the end, they did what they always did. Once one type of music got a bit of airplay and popularity, they tried to find the next 30 bands in that same genre. But just as fast as labels could pump out copycat bands, the scene of popular rock music shifted just as fast. In this episode, I'm talking with Anthony Merchant from the Power Chord Hour podcast and the host of Jamestown, New York's 107.9 WRFA Powered Chord Hour at 8 p.m. Eastern on Friday nights. We're going to explore how these genres took over the airwaves, reshaped the industry, and made the 1990s the most transformative decade in rock history. All right. Hey, Anthony, welcome to the Powered by Rock podcast. This is Anthony Merchant from Power Chord Hour. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Isaac. I've been looking forward to this.
So obviously I wanted to bring up this topic with you. We've been kind of speaking before and back and forth a little bit about this topic of the 90s, right? How big and transformational the music of the 90s was. I've kind of been feeding it and weeding it through episodes and skirting around the topic lately on some of the podcast episodes. But I figured today was probably a good time to just sit down and talk about what was going on in the 90s. Like, there was so much happening that, like I've said in past podcast episodes, like, if you were going through it at the time, you didn't even realize how fast those transformations were happening, where all of a sudden grunge was the new thing. And then all of a sudden alternative, geek rock, pop punk, nu metal, ska, everything was kind of coming in and out, right? It was just every 2 years, something new was the new fad. And I would say the 90s was kind of like the fad decade, right? Like, there was so much happening. Like, every couple of years, it was like, if you're not in part of this fad, you're wearing stuff from 2 years ago, you're not cool anymore, right? It's like, what the hell? So I would say let's go and kind of start this at the beginning, and let's talk about the rise of grunge and alternative rock, which was basically right around the 1990 mark, 1991, somewhere in there. And I would say that starts up in the Pacific Northwest, and I think it was about 1991. You could say a little earlier. There were some bands kind of doing some stuff, like Soundgarden was already active, Alice in Chains was already active, so was Nirvana. And, the gray skies of Seattle kind of mirrored the brooding, introspective sound of a new musical movement, which would become known as grunge. Bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, like I said, brought out a raw, unpolished sound that contrasted sharply with that glam metal and hair metal bands of the 80s. And it wasn't just a genre, right? It was a look. It was a rebellion against the excesses of the previous decade. So the 80s was all about, greed is good, Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, right? Cocaine, money, big hair, big, everything, right? It was just this big Coke commercial everywhere. And grunge was just not that, right? So it was let's give it back from the haves to the have-nots. That's kind of what the way that grunge went. And finally, it kind of started thriving when, Nirvana kind of came in with the album Nevermind. That was a catalyst, obviously, with the breakout single Smells Like Teen Spirit, which basically turned the music industry on its head, and suddenly flannel shirts and ripped jeans were in, and the glossy, overproduced rock of the 80s was out. So bring me back to your perspective on this time period in this era, and tell me what you were thinking while this was all going down.
So I was, it's funny. I probably caught on to, because Nirvana was one of my favorite bands growing up, but I found them when I was 13. I'm 31. So I was 13 in 04, 05. So I mean, you know what I mean? I kind of found
college in 04. Come on, man.
I was after. So I was born in 92. So I was but at the same time, what's interesting about this, and I still have a lot to say, because I had young parents, so a lot of that stuff was still around. I remember finding like my parents had a copy of Nevermind on CD before I listened to it. I just remember in like my dad's CD collection. So like it was around, but I didn't really actively, I probably heard it in passing, but like that, like, you know, really noticing what it was or paying attention, not till like early 2000s, but I mean, it quickly became Nirvana specifically. I mean, one of my favorite bands growing up, and definitely a like, it's funny because like a lot of stuff I listen to now, I go back and go like, oh yeah, you know, Nirvana was definitely that gateway where like Husker Du I love now, but I don't know that I would have gone into them without that Nirvana. Like Nirvana was that bridge, I think. I think it will probably get to a lot of other genres. And sometimes I call them, this may be a terrible analogy, but there's the wine coolers of music. And I've used this analogy with like Blink-182 and Green Day and different things where not everybody starts into punk rock by listening to like Crass or like some really like, you know, like getting really, really into the paint with punk. Sometimes you need those like entryways, that like wine cooler. You don't start with like whiskey or something, a hard liquor. You start with something that's easier to digest and it gets you in there. And I think Nirvana is one of those in the early 90s. And again, later on, your Blinks, your Green Days, you know, and there's ones with skas and stuff. But yeah, I mean, for me, grunge, definitely starting with Nirvana and then on and off throughout. I mean, I really do like grunge, but I think a lot of it I noticed I maybe got into more of even like the last 10 years. Like if I'm being honest, man, like even like Screaming Trees, I started listening to them a few years ago. It was like, oh, this band's really good. And it was like maybe 2022 I really started, you know, knowing of them, but didn't really start listening to more like recent years.
Yeah, and this is an interesting perspective that I also want to bring up because my wife's about your age. Her sister is in a band. She's 5 years younger than her. All of her friends kind of listen to 90s music, which is crazy to me that like we're still talking about, when I was growing up 80s and 90s, like we weren't listening to necessarily 60s, 70s, 80s music all the time. We were kind of listening to what was on the radio, but at the same time we knew of and listened to some of those old bands and stuff like that because our parents did. But it seems like a lot of younger people right now are listening to stuff that I wouldn't even consider, not that it wasn't popular, but it just didn't seem like it hit that hard back then. And now all of a sudden it's more popular now than it was back then. And one band in particular, this is just kind of off topic, but one band in particular, everybody in around the age group between like 24 and 30 right now seems to know who the Talking Heads are. And I was like, well, that's interesting because the Talking Heads were good, but I was like, I liked them, but I was never like deeply like, I didn't know all the words of their songs. I didn't buy their albums, but everybody's like, how do you not know the Talking Heads? I'm like, what, how do you know who the Talking Heads are? How is that possible that you know who like, David Byrne and all these guys were from like, I wouldn't say just a mediocre band, but it's like just in my perspective of that band, while that band was famous, it was kind of like they were a quirky, unique band, kind of like a Devo. And they just kind of came in and kind of went out, but like they had a decent run, but then I didn't hear from them for like 20 years. And then they kind of did a reunion in maybe like the 2010 ish, I want to say, but I'll have to look that up later. And now all of a sudden they're big again with like kids these days. I'm like, that seems strange. So it is like, you being 31 and having this, I got into Nirvana in 2004 kind of mentality. It's one of those things that draws me in, and it makes me even more kind of aware that, this music of the 90s, the music of certain bands of this era really resonate. It doesn't matter. It doesn't feel like it's old music, right? Like Nirvana still doesn't feel like it's old music. Like when I listen to music that my dad listened to, right, like Aerosmith from the 70s, I'm like, that felt like old music, even in like 1985 when they were still an active band, and they still were an active band until this year, obviously, but like they were in the peak of their musicianship. I was like, this feels like old music. Like this is like dad music.
Yeah.
Nirvana still doesn't seem like dad music. It's that rebellious spirit like, you would have as a young person. So it's interesting that you brought that up, that you didn't get into it obviously until, you being in basically middle school or high school or early, well, I guess late middle school, right? So
yeah, like sixth or maybe seventh grade, I'm going to say. I would say like seventh grade.
Yeah, because when I was growing up, the first things I was listening to was pop music, because grunge wasn't on the radio yet. This is what I'm talking about, like, Boys to Men, Ace of Base.
Oh, yeah.
Prince, there's like Michael Jackson. That was the kind of stuff that was on the radio that you would just know, right? Like nowadays, like Bruno Mars, Ed Sheeran, like that kind of same thing. But we didn't have that option of just hearing rock music, new rock music, it was always like Def Leppard, Guns N' Roses, that kind of stuff. And I was like, it's better than pop, I guess. But at the same time, I never really got into that music because I was like, everybody seemed to be like a heroin addict or, a complete degenerate waste of space. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be like that. So I don't aspire to, I don't relate to those lyrics or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the new wave stuff from the 80s. So it's very interesting. So, I think I had to be convinced that grunge was going to be this new thing because I didn't quite get it at first because it was like, I don't dress like that. I don't look like that. I don't quite get it. I'm not depressed all the time. But I could relate to that a hell of a lot more than pop music and a lot more than like glam and hair metal music. So I don't know what's your kind of take on like the relatability of grunge at that time.
Well, I think what's interesting, and I've always thought this is very interesting, and I will say that, like, I don't hate hair metal. I definitely am more in grunge, but, like, listen, like, I think Appetite for Destruction, I think it's a great record. Like, I don't mind the hits of a lot of the hair metal bands, but, like, grunge is more the genre that I actually listen to the records and the bands and all that, if that makes sense. Like, I won't turn off Def Leppard on the radio, but I also, I really don't have any of their records either, kind of thing.
Yeah.
What I always thought was interesting, and this kind of actually what I think is interesting too, how like I was later on, but you were there when it's happening. The thing about grunge with it killing hair metal is it's not that I don't disagree with that statement, but what I've always thought is interesting is that that's always been the big thing, how like Nirvana came out and overnight like hair metal went away. But don't you feel like most genres, I mean, that's just a big genre being replaced. Like, I mean, if you look at it, we're at this cusp of a new decade. Like, if grunge wasn't going to take out hair metal, something else was going to. And I don't disagree. Like, I've always agreed with it, but I've always thought it was so interesting that that's the big one everyone always talks about is grunge killing hair metal, where I'm like, hair metal killed something else. I mean, hair metal killed whatever was before it, and whatever was before hair metal killed that. You know what I mean? It's like, and if you go down the list, you end up like you were talking about, like Aerosmith and stuff, but it just keeps going down where the thing that's big right now kills what came before it. I do think maybe one of the reasons, though, why it's brought up more, and you were talking about it, is the difference of the night and day of one's very excessive. We're drinking, we're doing drugs, we're doing, I mean, it's just, and like you're talking about too, not even that crazy relatable. Like I'm not playing in an arena in Indianapolis tonight and, with groupies and drugs and alcohol and making thousands of dollars or whatever. Like I can't relate to that. Grunge is more relatable. So like, I mean, I do think there's that interesting aspect where I do think they are night and day, like in a lot of ways. But then at the same time, I think it's interesting because I also don't know that some of the influences aren't the same. Like, I honestly think there's more, like, I mean, 'cause it goes back to punk, but it's like, like even like with Guns N' Roses, a lot of those guys were into punk music and probably liked a lot of the records that Kurt Cobain did. But it comes out more in Kurt Cobain's, obviously it comes out more in Nirvana, but like, I mean, I think those guys liked Fear and TSOL and like all the old school punk bands. Like I'm pretty sure Guns N' Roses, a lot of those guys liked punk as well. It just, and the Ramones and stuff, but it's like all that, I think it's more prominent in grunge and Nirvana. But I think that's an interesting part too, where I don't know that influences are that crazy off of each other, but it's cool to see what the end product is, where one, you don't really hear punk anymore, even though I still think they were into it. And the other, it's like, oh yeah, you hear the direct. I mean, like, again, to bring up Husker Du, like, now that I love Husker Du, I think they're one of the best bands. And like now I go back and listen to Nirvana and you're like, oh my God, like you hit like, there's no way Kurt Cobain could deny, like he had to love Bob Mould's songwriting. Like that guy had to have loved, and I know there's a famous, I don't know how much you know about into it, but like the Replacements are my favorite band. And there's a whole thing about Kurt Cobain kind of denying that the Replacements influenced them, and that bothered Paul Westerberg, the singer of the Replacements. Now, I do agree with Paul Westerberg. I think Kurt Cobain was influenced by him, but for some reason didn't want to admit it, even though I hear the Replacements all over Nirvana. But yeah, like, I don't know. I think I don't know. I just think it's interesting. The kind of going back to that where like, we talk about so much over the years, grunge killing hair metal. But again, I think there's some similarities, not a lot, but there are some similarities and stuff that are there that, I don't know. I think it's interesting when you start dissecting them more and more.
Like when you talk about like the influences, right? I mean,
yeah,
the difference between, I think the end product everybody could start with the same 6 bands, and then you would have 400 bands with 400 different sounds kind of coming out of those 6 bands, right? Because that's kind of what happened, really.
Actually, in the
reality.
90s, we could do that even to this day with like Nirvana, Weezer, Blink-182, Green Day. I don't
Exactly.
know, throw like an alternative rock band or something. It's like those 6 bands have
Yeah.
influenced, alternative rock.
Radiohead. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. Like since
So
they've came out, you still hear them in the blueprints of music to this day.
exactly. And so I think the difference, obviously, like you're saying, the end product, I think one genre, the hair metal and even like heavy metal and like hard rock, like Metallica's and Megadeth and stuff like that. The difference between the 80s and 90s in those rock musicians and those rock groups was that I think they tried, and this is where the power ballad became a thing, right? Like I think they tried to like perfect the craft, whereas like in the 90s it was like, I just want to play the music. I want to make the songs. I don't have to perfect anything. And then I'm going to inspire 10 million other kids just like me to actually go and pick up a guitar and play the music and write the songs instead of perfecting the craft. That's the
Yeah.
reason why I started playing guitar and writing songs, because I was like, if I was ever going to have to write a song like Megadeth or Metallica or Guns N' Roses, I was never going to write a song, right?
Yeah.
I was like, there's no chance. Like, I don't care how good I get. I don't think that's going to it's not repeatable. I was just thinking about this today on my morning bike ride. I listen to Cursive a lot. Cursive is
Oh,
obviously a kind of
nice.
underground emo,
Great
not
band.
well known necessarily, but they got their place. And I was like, they might be one of the least covered bands in the history of the world. And I think it's because nobody can really do what they do. The talent of the singing, the talent of the band, the timing changes, everything else is like, you get diminishing returns for trying to cover them as an artist, because
Yeah.
they're not super popular enough to where other people who are listening are going to even know what the song is. And you have to try so damn hard to be good at it that you probably are going to waste the time and effort to even get people into the song and draw them in anyway. So it's like, maybe that's a reason why, a band like Cursive is so hard to cover. But
I
people
agree with
obviously do
that.
it with Nirvana, with Megadeth, Metallica, Guns N' Roses all the time, because they can play that part and they can replicate it. But to come up with that thing in the first place, it's very, very difficult to do that.
Well, kind of going back to that, like that terrible wine cooler analogy of mine,
Yeah.
what you're talking about with like the accessibility, I think that's such an important thing too, because same thing for me, it was probably Blink-182, but then it's also like the Ramones and different things where, I'm with you. I can't like play a crazy, so like I play guitar and bass, but like I play power chords. I don't like riff. I'm not a
Hence the
soloist.
name of your podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly. I play, and you know what's so funny about that? A lot of people are surprised I play guitar, and I'm like, why would someone like? I guess if someone named their show Power Chord Hour, I'd just assume. I feel like
Yeah.
that's a little too like, it's not musical jargon, but it's enough in there where I'm like, I don't think you would name it that if you didn't have at least a little knowledge.
Yeah.
But
I could call it articulating arpeggios. Would that help you understand when I know how to play
the
guitar?
articulating arpeggios hour. I love it. No, but like honestly, I think there's something to really be said about, I don't know, like I'm not a big classic rock guy. Like again, that's another one where it's like I don't hate Led Zeppelin or anything, but I listen to what's on the radio. I don't own any Led Zeppelin records. If they're
Yeah.
on, I won't turn them off, but I'm not gonna go buy an album. But
Yeah.
like things like that where I can't play like those guys, but I can play all of Dude Ranch. I can learn how to play Dude Ranch front to back in a weekend. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I
That
can.
day, likely.
Yes, you can, and you may even be able to play it better than the band themselves. Like, I mean, like, and I mean, Blink-182 are one of my favorite bands, but like, there is same with the Ramones, where it's like, it's not a whole lot, But funny enough, when you overthink it, it is. I will say there is a secret talent to that, where there's musicians who overplay who can't play the Ramones to save their life. I've
Yeah.
talked to people who are like, there's Berkeley musicians who can't just fucking play Blitzkrieg Bop because they can't
Yeah.
figure out how just to play bar chords, dude. Don't
Yeah.
start adding things. Don't start doing like enough,
Are you
man. Like
sure I'm supposed to just do this the whole time? Yeah.
in
Downstrum. Don't do anything else. Don't do upstrokes.
so I will give them credit in that way where like there is still, I mean, I definitely think there's skill in that, but like I do still think the Ramones and things like that are way more accessible. Like you're saying, like I can't play, a lot of like I can't fucking play a Guns N' Roses riff, but I can play the Damn It riff. I can learn how to play Damn It. And
Exactly.
like I think there's something to be said. Same with like a Weezer or something. I mean, you still hear them everywhere, and it's like it's fairly simple. It's not overly, there's little solos here and there, but it's not overly like, it's in a good pocket, I would say. It's a nice balance of things.
Yeah, and I think Weezer did a really good job of taking they actually are all really good musicians, and they
Yeah.
tone it down for the sake of the music, right? So like that's another thing is like, does the song require a 5-minute guitar solo? Probably not. Sit down, Slash. Let's like actually listen to what the song is about instead of just listening to a ripping guitar solo for whatever reason.
Talking a little bit about how like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't mind like hard rock and the hair metal of the 80s, but like again, to drive it back home to what we're talking about, the difference is I like the singles and radio hits of that, whereas like I've like the Blue Album's one of the best albums ever. Like I love like Blue Album, Pinkerton, all these albums from the 90s are full front to back. I love them. I listen to them on my own accord. Like I want to listen, you know what I mean? Like that's what's in my record collection. Like I don't hate the stuff that came before it in the 80s, but a lot of that stuff I'll listen to on the radio. It's not something I'll listen to, like after this, if I go for a walk or something, I walk the dog, I'm probably listening to something from the 90s and not the 80s on my I say iPod, my iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah. You're old enough to know what an iPod is, at least.
My Zune.
Yeah, I had one of those actually. I was like, man, this thing's awesome. Like everybody else was like, why would you get a Zune? And like 2 years later, they stopped like existing. I was like, yeah, that sounds about right.
I did always say with Zune, and we don't have to stay on Zunes, but the coolest thing about that was, couldn't you share a song to other people who had a Zune for like, they could listen to it like 3 times or something? I thought it was the coolest concept.
Yeah. There was some pretty cool technology baked in that just never latched on. And then as soon as the iPhone came out, everybody was like, never mind, we don't need these things. Yeah, I kind of remember at the time during this Nirvana explosion, right? It was absolutely unexpected, which, from my perspective, I was probably 10, 11 years old when this whole thing was going on. And, old enough to actually know what music is at the time, going to concerts and stuff like that. There was actually a band that a lot of record labels were a couple record labels and specifically were banking on becoming what Nirvana actually did. And a lot of people thought it was going to be like Sonic Youth or Alice in Chains or, Soundgarden, right? Like some of these other bands that kind of had been growing for a while. And it was like Nirvana just like puts out this one album that they kind of just threw together, got rid of their old drummer, got Dave Grohl in there, put out their next album, and suddenly, boom, like they hit, right? So like Sonic Youth was now writing the coattails of Nirvana. Alice in Chains is now writing the coattails of Nirvana. Soundgarden is kind of writing the coattails. That's crazy because they're like one of the newest bands, but they just had this surge of energy, and you could feel it even just like, if you ever watch the Unplugged, the Nirvana Unplugged thing, there's an energy, even when they're taking all the energy out of their songs, that you're like,
still there.
This is the energy that you're talking about. It's undeniable. You could sit there and watch Chris Cornell in concert and you get that he's a rock star, right? But at the same time, you're like, it's not that. Like, I don't know what Kurt Cobain and Nirvana had, but it wasn't. Soundgarden never had that. They were still a great rock band, but they never had that. And so it was always these guys riding the coattails, and even bands like Radiohead, Smashing Pumpkins, r.e.m. All these guys ended up kind of riding the coattails of Nirvana in different ways, right? So it was like,
they got major label deals because of Nirvana. That wouldn't have been a thing. None of those bands you just mentioned probably would have had you wouldn't have seen them on MTV and gotten, the deals that they did had it not been for Nirvana. There's no way that major labels are probably going to touch half those bands you just mentioned.
Yeah. And I think even what's more notable is the fact that Nirvana obviously stopped existing, right? Kurt Cobain killed himself. I think it was 1994.
Yeah.
Very shortly after their success, right? So like 3 years, that band.
That's crazy to think of.
3 years.
Jeez.
Actively. And they are still one of the most popular and one of the most famous bands of all time, which is crazy. Again, it's not one of those members of the 27 Club, right? So like Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain. I think it was Janis Joplin was another one.
Yep.
So like however many people, it was that, died at the age of 27. By now, like, I think it's pretty interesting that, like, if you think about this, Kurt Cobain's, existence in the mainstream was from his age 24 to 27. That's all he had.
Jeez.
Imagine if you only had 3 years to become famous, and it was those 3 years. Like, I can't even imagine. Like, I've been like, I was doing nothing from 24 to 27 that was ever going to get me famous. So I was like, that's a lot of pressure. And I understand why a lot of these bands were like struggling to attain peace of mind, and drugs and alcohol were a thing because they were just, record labels were dumping money into these basically kids.
Oh yeah.
Just don't know what to do with it. Like, they're not going to invest in a house necessarily. They're going to go out and party. Like, what do you do when you're 25 years old? You party a lot, right? So that's kind of what was going on. It was crazy.
I do think that's that genuine part where even like, I mean, I talk about this all the time with people on the Power Chord Hour, but like where if you try to force it, I think it would be terrible. Like, I think if Kurt Cobain, because I don't know, I've read a bunch of things where like, what's his name? Butch Vig had to like convince him if he wanted to do anything in the studio, it'd have to be like the Beatles did it. Like, Kurt Cobain didn't want to like double his vocals until Butch Vig is like, no, Paul McCartney does it. So it's like, oh, okay, now I'll do it. But like, if he was more compliant and was like trying to make a major label album and trying to polish their sound, I think Nevermind would be an awful album, and they wouldn't have the place. Like, in the 90s specifically, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about this, but a lot of the records that did the best were ones again, the Blue Album doesn't, like, it makes sense afterwards. Like, when I'm talking about, like, I discovered Weezer around the same time I discovered Nirvana, and at that point it's not weird because there's thousands of bands that sound like Weezer and have ripped them off by 2004. But when they came out, that's a pretty wild band to be on, like, to put on MTV, put on the radio, give a major label budget, like work with Rick Ocasek and stuff, like, all these.
They were a band for like a year.
Like, that doesn't, like, they're, I even, like, I don't know, I always think of like the Violent Femmes in the 80s of being that kind of original, of like that kind of quirky alternative, and like, even they didn't really blow up till later on in their career, and even they weren't on a major for a long time till like later. Actually, I think a couple of their last records before they broke up in the 90s, like before that wasn't like a viable commercial kind of, thing. So like the Weezers, the Nirvanas, just bands like that. I still laughed at Blink-182. I mean, like, their first major label, called Dude Ranch, and then Enema of the State. And it's like, that's hilarious. Like, there's bands who, like, I think before and after the 90s probably wouldn't have been on a major. And I think Nirvana, that's the other thing, is like, Nirvana's like the Beatles, where I don't care. You don't have to like them, but you have to acknowledge, like, I don't care what you might think they're the worst band ever. And I know that's not really what most people think. They love both those bands. But no matter what you think, there's certain bands that, like, you can't deny. Like, I mean, they had direct effects on people's, careers, whether those people knew it or not. There's bands from the 90s who the whole reason they never had to listen, maybe they weren't influenced by Nirvana at all, but if they were something under the guise of like alternative rock, like Nirvana helped you. Nirvana, if you were on MTV or you got on a major or something, it was probably because of the effects of Nirvana. You were feeling the effects of that, even later on.
Yeah, and that's one thing that, it doesn't really happen in rock music now because there's not a big rock band that's kind of carrying this next generation of rock bands with them, right?
Yeah.
People thought, oh yeah, Machine Gun Kelly brought pop punk back. I'm like, no, he didn't. Because name another single other pop punk band that's kind of ridden that wave since he put out that album.
Can I say, not to like get sidetracked, but like even when that was happening, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, he helps himself get on the radio. Any good pop punk bands didn't get exposure from that. There were no, like, it wasn't like all of a sudden people who you're big fans of who couldn't like make ends meet were all of a sudden getting pools and like getting nice houses in the year 2021 because like pop punk got elevated. It elevated the guy who was already famous.
Yeah.
It didn't help anybody else.
Avril Lavigne to make another album and Sum 41 to make another album, but we already knew who those people were, right? It's like, okay.
Exactly.
Anything back.
It does nothing. Whereas like with like a Nirvana, I mean, there were so many unknown bands who got a chance. Like, that's a very good point that I don't know that I've thought of much before, but like, yeah, you're right. Like, Machine Gun Kelly and things like that aren't really elevating anybody, but back then there were bands who did truly, and I don't know the last time that happened. I mean, I think major labels obviously dried up. I think there was a little in the early 2000s with pop punk where there was like that. It was the very end of major labels still signing pop punk bands, where like, I think before 2004, you still had the residual Blink-182 kind of where like,
and no coming out.
Yeah. Like no band, some bands, I guess I should say, broke that big, but a lot of them never made it to like that size. But I mean, there were bands who never, I think there were a lot of those even drive-through bands who got upstream to majors where like, I don't think there was another time and place where that would have happened. It was kind of a couple years later, that wasn't going to happen at all. You got kind of the end of it there.
I do want to just circle back to the Weezer
totally.
thing, which was, they came out obviously shortly after, right? Like right after Nirvana kind of came and went, like there's all of a sudden Weezer filling this gap of, you know, normal guys playing music again. And it's like, okay, well, it's a different sound. It's not grunge necessarily. It kind of sounded grungy with the guitars, but the vocals, the harmonies, the melodies, the kind of intricacies of what they're doing. And like you said, not the overproduction wasn't really there. Like they weren't sitting, down and quadrupling vocals and 62 tracks of vocal harmonies in there to make sure something sounded right. Right. They just did it simply. They did it very well. And then they inspired a whole genre called geek rock, and then a whole bunch of other alternative bands like Bare Naked Ladies, The Rentals, obviously directly. That's Matt Sharp's band. He was in Weezer, but even, help give rise to other bands. Like you said, even people like Violent Femmes, They Might Be Giants, some of these bands, Wayne, that kind of sound. These bands kind of started coming back around. And it was like, you never really you don't see this anymore. You don't see a band come up, create this huge buzz, and then all of a sudden there's this like, let's bring everything with it, like a whirlwind, right? Like the Wizard of Oz, like this tornado comes through and just like tears everything up and starts carrying it off to the wild world of Oz or whatever you want to call it. But I think when I look back at Weezer, Nirvana, two of the most influential bands as far as not just changing the sound of the time, but also causing a direct influence of growth in this genre of their particular pockets of rock, right?
I'm not the first to ever like bring this up, and I mean we have to go like super far in, but even going back to that being genuine and why I think like Blue Album and Nevermind and stuff blew up so much, like I don't know your feelings about like later era Weezer. I don't know if you particularly care for what they do anymore. Like I love the first couple Weezer records, but like this goes back to what bothers me the most about Rivers Cuomo is like all the co-writes and all the producers and stuff on later stuff. Dude, you can write a song. You wrote 2 records that influenced, like to this day, there are bands that literally just sound like Pinkerton. Like there are bands that just sound influenced by your first 2 records. And like, I think some of it, I do feel like some of it's like this passive aggressive, like I still think he's like, obviously the whole disaster with Pinkerton is far gone and history has been pretty well to it. I think it's treated a lot better than it did when it like happened, but I still feel like there's a part of him that holds on to, all right, you fuckers don't want it. Like you don't like Pinkerton. You don't like me being raw. Like now I'm going to give you the most dumb pop songs I can write with 4 other guys. And like, I think that's why they don't hit anymore. Like it's the first 2 records that influence all these bands. It's not like Make Believe or Ratitude. Ratitude isn't the album that like defined a generation. And those are the ones who have the most co-writes and like there's features on it. There's, like the one album has like Lil Wayne on a song and there's like all these weird, like
talk about that.
There's some weird ones on there where it's just like, just make a Weezer record, man. Just put loud power chords and like write a nice melody. And it's like, how to do this, yet he won't. And again, like, I think there's something to be said about the best Weezer records are the ones that they didn't think that much of. Like it was them and it was raw and it was real. And now going off that, again, I talk about this on the show a lot. I know other people do, and I would like your opinion, but I do think one of the reasons though, and I think Weezer still has a big influence, but Weezer and Nirvana are interesting because, again, Kurt Cobain, like you were saying, it's crazy. 3 years of success and Nirvana's gone. And he joined the 27 Club. But that also means that they are a snapshot in time. And, like, Nirvana can't make their Ratitude. Like, Weezer can. Weezer's still together. They can make the Hurleys and the Ratitudes. They can embarrass themselves. Yes, they can keep doing things that tarnish their legacy, where with Nirvana, after 1994, they really can't. I mean, like, the estate can. I mean, there's things that are like, oh, geez, like, Nirvana shirts at Walmart, like things like that, where it's like, people who aren't, Kurt Cobain have say, but it's like overall, you have that legacy where Kurt Cobain can't write a bad record at 45. You know what I mean? Like, he can't get into there's not that weird Nirvana record because they didn't get a chance to. And in a way that I think that helped them. You know, obviously it'd be much better if Kurt Cobain was still with us and like he still got to write music, and I'm sure there'd be amazing things in there.
I
But I
think
do
he'd be the
think
kind of guy that would just quit playing music at like 30 anyway. Like he would have just been like,
I could see
I
that actually.
I'm done. Like
And
I don't want it
there's
anymore.
there's integrity in that. I would
Yeah.
like honestly respect that, but I do think there is something to be said about that where like you notice it with bands where bands who break up and get back together sometimes it's the best thing to happen to your career. If the ones who
Yeah.
stay together all the years and keep like a consistent lineup, people kind of forget about that sometimes. People like I think you get more accolades when you break up, make people wait and come back than the guys who are like, yeah, it's been the four of us since like 1992. We don't hate each other. We've written records,
Yeah.
consistently toured. No one, I shouldn't say no one cares, but those aren't generally the bands who are doing huge. Like some of the ones who are lifers don't really get it as much as the ones who like break up, make people want what they can't have, and then later come back. You know, and again, with
Yeah.
Nirvana, they can't do that. But I don't know. I think those are all, and I don't know if that takes us anywhere, but I just think all those points are interesting with like the Weezer, the Nirvana, and then just the not being able to, you know, embarrass yourself. Like Kurt Cobain couldn't write Beverly Hills. He never got the chance to write, you know,
Thank God.
Beverly Hills basically.
Yeah, and I'll respond to that with two short stories, and hopefully I'll keep this, and so we can move on to the next topic. But so the Simpsons one time had an episode that got pretty meta, and they actually talked about this show Itchy and Scratchy running forever, and then the kids kind of forgetting it was there. I think maybe it was not just Itchy and Scratchy; it might have been the Sideshow Bob or one of the
Oh
one of
yeah.
the shows that they watched or whatever, and like they just stopped watching it. And you know, I think something happened where they were trying to have to explain why they just didn't watch anymore. And Simpsons were saying like, why aren't our ratings as high as they used to be? And it was basically the same thing. Like when you just, you know, you like it, the Simpsons probably are still good. I haven't watched the Simpsons since like probably 2003,
Saying
but I wouldn't dislike it. I don't think if I watched it, it's just like, it's just there. We know it's there. And this is exactly what they said in the episode. It's like, we know it's there. We can always come back to it. We just have this comfortability that we don't have to. It's like an old friend. Like you don't have to see them all the time. You can come back whenever you want. And so that's very much like that band that sticks around like Weezer. Now, Family Guy, on the other hand, a very other popular Fox animated series, was actually canceled after I think a third season.
Yeah.
It didn't come back for like 7 years. And then all of a sudden it was wildly popular again. It was like the #1 rated show, had spin-offs left and right. And, you know, Seth MacFarlane, who basically was kind of out of work for a while, not necessarily out of work, but like out of kind of mainstream work.
Yeah.
All of a sudden was doing his own movies. You know, I was like, how did he get, you know, to star in an action movie with Charlize Theron? It's like, this doesn't even make any sense. Like this guy's an animated, you know, voiceover character actor or whatever, but it's that, right? Like it's kind of like what you're saying there in the sense that, you know, the idea is that if something's there long enough, you know, you can always come back to it. And Weezer has like, OK Human was a good record. That came out in 2021, I want to say, or 2022.
I've not checked it out now.
It was totally a Weezer record. Then you do like Van Weezer and you're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, knock this shit off. Like, this is terrible.
This is why I think he's trolling people, because he does know how to write songs, but it's like he'll give it to you for a second. Like the album, I can't think of the name, but the one they put out in like 2014 with Back to the Shack and a couple, like that wasn't a terrible record. But like they'll give you that one, but then they'll like slap you in the face with the next three. Like I swear he's like trolling us as fans.
Yeah, yeah. And then you're right. So that was kind of my other point, is that Rivers Cuomo, I think, had his heart broken twice as a member of Weezer. Once when Pinkerton flopped, basically commercially when it came out, and second when they were doing Maladroit, which I still think is a good album.
That's not a bad record. Not a bad record.
Maladroit, but he tried to get they basically kept leaking the songs out to fans as part of like an experiment to see which ones would make the album in the end. And he got bad suggestions. He thought that all the fan suggestions were just bad. Like he was like, basically, this is a terrible idea. And he actually said the phrase, the suggestions were whack. I was like, well, that's a very nerdy way of saying that, but okay. So in the end, they basically chose their own songs for Maladroit, but it was that thing. Like, I think he kept feeling like, I just have to release pop music because I need this band to survive. It is our income. It is a gravy train, so to say, but I also want to write my own stuff. So maybe like every 3 albums I can do that or something to that effect, but he still has to put out pretty consistently, like, you know, pretty generic rock, corporate rock music. And then every once in a while, when there's like this lull in his downtime, he's like, oh, in between records, well, I just happened to make this whole album. I was like, well, that's the fucking best one. Why didn't you promote that one? What the fuck are you doing?
And also, I think sometimes he's not happy that Pinkerton is now beloved. And if I'm being honest, I think he wishes people didn't like that record and they didn't. Not that I think they play much of it live. Like when I've seen them, they just kind of do greatest hits. You might get El Scorcho, but like I think he would rather
the infamy of that album.
To me, it's like, I don't know. I think he wants you to almost not. I think at that point, I think since it was a flop when it happened, I think he would rather people just keep thinking that. I do. I truly think it bothers him that people list it so much as like such a great record and so beloved and stuff. And in a way, I understand it, but in another, it's just like, you can't predict that. Like, you got big off something that you didn't think you were going to get big off of. I don't think you wrote My Name is Jonas thinking that's like, like that's a beloved album opener and stuff. Like, I just think they were putting something genuine out in the world. And then when he stops putting out the genuine stuff, it's genuinely not good anymore.
Yep. That's pretty much my thoughts on Weezer. I mean, I love the first two by far the most, but there are a pocket of like maybe 5 or 6 albums that have enough good songs in there where I can still say these are really good albums by Weezer. The other 7 to 10 or whatever are genuinely mostly bad, and there might be a song or two on there that I'm like, okay, I can listen to this. But the Black Album, the Teal album of all covers, Jesus Christ, I hated all of that, every second of that. I was like, why?
I was okay with the Green album, but after that, like trying to do the color albums, like after like Blue and Green was fun. And actually Red has a couple songs I don't mind, but like, yeah, you're beating a dead horse. Like, okay, we get it. It's the 4 of you in front of a square of some kind of color on this album. Like, we get it, man.
That's the show for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you learned anything or like what you heard on the show today, please show us some support and subscribe to this channel and like, comment, and share this video with a friend or put it up on social media. I hate to keep asking, but without those small actions, the YouTube bots pretty much ignore this channel. Putting these videos out is a lot of work, and if you want to show your appreciation, please consider purchasing some of our musical accessories or merch from our store at poweredbyrock.com. You can read our blog and follow us in the links below as well. Those are the plugs, and that's all I have. I'll see you soon for the next episode. Until then, rock on.